Good morning. Welcome to the church that meets here at Withamsville. This begins our 45 minutes of Bible class before worship. If this is the first time that you're joining us this morning, we've been covering the letters of John. Right now we're at 1 John. Jeff Painter has been teaching the past couple of weeks, and I'm co-teaching. I don't want to flatter or embarrass Jeff, but I would liken him to a well of knowledge that is very experienced, very educated, and I would consider myself more of a bucket. Eventually you're going to hit a bottom. So I hope it's still useful for you all. I know Jeff will provide very technical detail into the text. I will provide perhaps not more applicable than what he is providing, but if it's on a scale, I would say mine's more applicable, cultural, but still with some good technical detail that we can sink our teeth into. So I'll recap first what we've been covering the last couple of weeks. We're in 1 John. John would have been the Apostle John, the one whom Jesus loved. The date that this letter would have been written would have been about the year 90 or so, plus or minus 5 years. Does anybody know when Jesus' ministry began? What year that would have been? Around 30. So this puts this letter about 60 years after the life of Jesus. Does anybody know how old the Apostle John was when Jesus began his ministry? Young adult. Yes, I think I heard 16 or 17. I've heard a lot of different theories before. I've heard as young as 12 or 14, and then I've heard somewhere around 20. So we can put him between 12 and 20 to be a little conservative. Generally, scholars would say that he was the youngest of the apostles. This would have put the other apostles in their late teens, early 20s, mid-20s. But I think generally, most of the 12 apostles would have been younger than Jesus, who was 30 when he began his ministry. So John really, for almost his entire life, would have known Jesus. His life would have been centered around Jesus. If we think back to major movements or events that began 50, 60 years ago from today, what are some that we could name? Think about the 1950s, 1960s, anything that swept the nation. Moon landing, okay. What about like a movement or a group? Hippies, there you go. We're talking about movements that are getting, that swept a nation that would have been very influential. Sorry? Women's Lib, I'm not familiar with that one. Oh, okay, Women's Liberation, okay. My mind went to the Beatles. I don't want to compare the Beatles to Jesus' ministry at all, but in terms of the cultural impact, the hippies perhaps would cover a broader net. And, John would have seen that from the beginning. For those of you who lived during the hippies movement, you would have seen what it was like to be in the moment while the hippies were around. You would have seen the next generation in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and you would have thought you weren't even alive during the hippies, but you're taking part in that movement. Yes, Charles?
I was thinking about that thing that came back in the 80s where everybody got together, all the famous musicians, and did that song, We Are the World.
Yes, Live Aid. Yeah. So John is in his old age. He's now seen generations after generations of new Christians, and he's concerned about what he's seeing taking place. There's this group of thinking, heavily influenced by Greek thinking, Gnosticism, and he's concerned, and so he has to write a letter to address that. And so this genre would be a circular letter. It would go around to many different churches. Think about Paul's letters. It was written to the Galatians with a specific issue, to the Corinthians with a specific issue, or perhaps to a specific person, Titus, Timothy. But John's letter here is more circular, meant to be shared to a broad group here in Ephesus. I'll do a quick recap of the times that we see John in the gospel. He's the disciple whom Jesus loved. He's a son of thunder. And we can guess maybe why he was considered a son of thunder, because at one point he wanted Jesus to send down fire from heaven and consume Samaritans. So perhaps maybe short-tempered. We think of Peter as being the one that is impulsive, but perhaps John had some anger issues. I don't know. He partnered with Peter. He was part of the inner circle. That'd be Peter, James, John, and he would have witnessed the transfiguration on the Mount. And for a short period of time, he had power from Jesus to heal sickness and cast demons. We see that in Mark 3. There are a lot of other different examples that we see John in the gospel. After all, he would have been with Jesus from the beginning. And at the very end of his gospel, he says he can't write about every single thing that Jesus did. It would fill the earth with books. So I'm sure there are many things here that John witnessed that we don't have written down. So there's two purposes that Jeff provided as to why John wrote this letter. Polemical, to confront, counter, and warn against false teaching, and practical, to provide assurance to Christians to stay faithful to the truth and the teaching they've already received. He had his deceivers, liars, and antichrists, oh my. These people, we won't spend too much time diving into every single doctrine that Gnosticism taught. After all, it's a bit complicated because it evolved from century to century. There's a lot of mystique as to exactly what first century Gnosticism entailed, but we can summarize it by saying that they denied that Jesus came in the flesh. This line of thinking was spirit good, flesh bad. And you can even see this in 1 Corinthians, whenever the Corinthians write to Paul. And Paul quotes them back and says, this matter that you have wrote to me about it is not good for a man to touch a woman. The problem there in that church was that husbands and wives were not being intimate with each other because of this line of thinking. Flesh is bad. How can I do something so sinful, such as intimacy? But Paul has to ground them and say, actually, the flesh is not, the way that you're thinking about flesh being bad is not true. And so we could see that in Gnosticism as well. They denied that Jesus was the Messiah. They denied that his death atoned for our sins. And really, the center of it was this hidden knowledge about how they knew God. So they taught false teaching about how one knows God. I believe it was last week, we talked about these if statements. If we say, if we say, if we say. If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. If we say we have not sinned, we make him a liar and his word is not in us. And so Jeff touched on kind of the practical steps here for these if we say statements, walking in the light, confessing our sins, and going to Jesus as our advocate. So this week, my mission, the challenge today, is to understand the ancient audience and translate for a modern audience today. I want to know how we know the truth. That's a mouthful. And I want to talk about walking in the plain, true, and visible light. So the passage we're going to cover is 1 John chapter 2, verses 3 through 11. We'll break that up into 3 chunks. But the first half of our class today, I want to touch on translating into a modern culture. And then the second half, we'll dive into the text with that context in mind as our framework. And it can be difficult trying to translate Gnosticism into first century. Does anybody today know a Gnostic teacher or a Gnostic group? Is this something that's on the rise in America? Not really. We can think about other issues that biblical writers have wrote about. Legalism in Galatians, we certainly can relate to that. We think about the litany of issues that the Corinthians faced, we can relate to a lot of those. We think about the Thessalonians and their concern about the end times and how Paul addressed that. We can relate to that as well. But when we think about Gnosticism, this feels distant. This feels ancient. Yes, Mark?
I don't want to interrupt you, but I have heard that the philosophy of our being disconnected from our physical being being kind of a form of Gnosticism. And that shows itself in the modern philosophy that you can choose, for example, your gender. That is one form of, you know, it's down the road a bit, but that kind of fits into that same thinking.
It's a good observation, a slippery slope, as you would say. Whenever you have this disconnect of the soul and the body, and you treat them as two different ones, how do you start treating your body if you feel that it is to be totally rejected and something to not be cherished? There's a fascinating series I listened to once called Degreasing the Church, and it was all about how Greek influence had gotten into the church. Jewish thinking was very focused on the physical, on the body. Greek thinking was very focused on the spiritual and disregarded the body. So yes, there's a lot of different ways that this disconnect of the soul and the body creeps today, and a lot of us still fall into that trap as well. But I won't quite dive into that rabbit hole for this morning, but thank you, Mark. So I think about the Gnostics. What is their core thing, their core principle? And it's this hidden knowledge. It's this knowledge that I know something about God that you don't and you have not had revealed to you yet. You don't have the full truth, I have the full truth. But it's personal, it's not given to you yet. That is the core of Gnostic thinking. And so I thought, what group best identifies that today is conspiracy theorists. They hold on to this hidden truth that is hidden from the public that only they know. So we will dive into that topic for the first half of the class, but I want to start by asking, how do we decide today what is true? About how we decided what was true a decade ago, or a century ago, or 20 centuries ago.
I always think about even a century ago, maybe not a decade ago, but whenever you would see a film of something, that was proof that it happened. Well, you can't assume that anymore. Some of these fake videos are so good, you have to, when it starts to get ridiculous, then you can start to say, wait a minute. But that's very different. We get fooled often that it's not easy deciding what's true.
Absolutely.
My grandchildren, just had this conversation with them. They think that if it's in the internet or it's in Google, it's true. It's got to be true.
Yeah.
So we just had this long conversation about what's truth and how do you know what's true? Because it's on the internet.
But I'm old enough to remember when you were raised, just because you read it on the internet doesn't mean it's true. And
part of what's been said too is just the sheer volume of information we're bombarded with, good or bad.
yeah.
So you have to be more discerning perhaps than you used to be.
Yeah, I'll share that it was just the other day I was sitting on the couch with my wife and I was scrolling Facebook, and I grew up in Corpus Christi, Texas, South Texas. And somebody that I knew, my friend's cousin, shared an article that a Los Angeles Dodgers baseball pitcher donated $106 million to local Corpus Christi hospitals to pay for the bills of cancer patients. I thought, wow, that's wonderful. So I showed Jenna and then clicked on the article and realized it was all fake. $106 million is like a lifetime of earnings for the best of the best when you consider taxes, agency fees. So that should have been my signal right away. But here I thought, wow, that's amazing, and showed it to her. And just like that, I shared fake news, and who knows who else it went to. So yes, we are bombarded with good and bad information. And the source of that is social media. You got Threads, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, lots of different platforms on there, YouTube. I read that 6 out of 10 people globally use social media. That's globally, where people may not have access to internet. So Americans, what would you guess we're at? 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10, I don't know, 9.4 out of 10. And would you say that social media use is going up or going down? Good answer, it is going way, way, way up. I don't know if you can see right there, I don't know who remembers using MySpace, But that's MySpace right there, 2003. Facebook is 2004, and then it just goes way up. And would you say that the information that you're getting on social media has become more true with more fact-checking, or less true with almost no fact-checking?
The 60s, before all this electronic, when you got received information on the news, and then later more television,
Actually, were around.
late 50s and 60s.
Get rounder.
So it goes way back before all this new electronic was.
That's right. When you think about how news got around in the 40s and 50s when television was really taking off, that would have been considered instantaneous. But there was quite a delay back then compared to what we can do now. So I'm sure 30 years from now, when we all have, news that we can receive instantaneously, I won't go down there, but 30 years from now, here I go, spouting conspiracy theory. 30 years from now, when the way we get news changes, we're going to look back today and think, wow, we got news so slowly back then. You think about 4G, how slow that feels. 3G, how slow that feels. It's just this exponential growth in the speed in which we get information. And again, most of the information, not most, but a lot of the information we get today is fake. The algorithms behind social media heavily favor getting your attention, getting you angry, getting you shocked, getting you confused, and they want you hooked. The social media companies profit, they make money by the longer you stay on their platform and you look at advertisements. So they have no incentive to make sure that truth is fact-checked. They have no incentive to make sure that things that are shared are true. And so this conspiratorial knowledge can get shared. I'll kind of zoom ahead a little bit. I think about how a conspiracy used to be formed. This is the conspiracy of the plot to kill Caesar. This would have been done through word of mouth, would have been done through letters, but it would have been much slower. But I want to emphasize that it was all done in the dark. Nobody held a meeting with Caesar there and said, all in favor of killing Caesar, say aye. This would have been done in the dark, and the Bible tells us that when men plot darkness, they want to stay in the dark. But the light came into the world, and men don't like the light. They want to stay in the darkness. So, as for the mass public, this is a study from the National Institute of Health. And I'll summarize here that generally speaking, there's no systematic evidence that this study could point to that says conspiracy theories are on the rise. However, if you look at the vibes of those that they surveyed, if you look at the feelings, everybody seems to indicate that it is something that is on the rise. So it's kind of an interesting parallel there, that we can't point to a specific point of data, but everybody seems to be concerned that it's getting higher and higher. And so the classic example, I don't know if you've ever seen this image before, not just an image of an iceberg, but this specific iceberg. This is an iceberg that I think really exemplifies the conspiratorial mindset. You have there at the top what's in the light, what is plain, what is true, what is visible to all. But underneath, if you look under the surface, you'll see all this hidden truth just waiting for you there. You just have to do some digging to find it out. So ignore what's up here, focus on what's down here. And so I want to use maybe a little bit of a silly example. I didn't want to choose a specific conspiracy that would inflame anybody. So I picked kind of a silly one, and it's the, you may have heard of it before, birds are not real. Birds are secretly, I've chosen this conspiracy theory to read to you all. It's the fact that birds are not real, they're secretly drones spying on you all, and there's cameras hidden in the birds. So stay with me, we're gonna use this to dive into 1 John, I promise. Okay, just hear me out for a second. I used to think this was insane too. I really did. I mean, we all grew up thinking birds were just birds, right? But then I started doing a little digging, not watching the news or whatever, they're all bought out anyway. I'm talking real people sharing their experiences online. Moms, hikers, people who actually notice what's going on. First of all, have you ever seen a baby pigeon? I mean, seriously, think about it. You've seen squirrels, baby bunnies, even baby snakes, but never once a baby pigeon. Isn't that odd? Why are pigeons just suddenly there, full grown, everywhere? I'm not saying all birds are fake, just maybe the ones that are always watching. You know the kind. They don't fly away when you walk past them. They just sit there, watching like they're programmed. You can't tell me that's normal. Anyway, I'm not trying to convince you. I just think people need to be asking more questions instead of trusting everything they've always been told. That's all I'm saying. Now, I know that sounds crazy, but we see a lot of that line of thinking today. So, what are the logical fallacies that we just heard? Because there's a ton there. We heard an appeal to anecdotal evidence. This is evidence that you can't refute because it happened to them personally. Again, there's a pattern finding. Our brains want to make sense of the world, and so it looks for patterns. There's a distrust of institution. So anything that is visible, anything that is widely accepted has to be rejected. There's the bandwagon fallacy. There's other moms, hikers, people on TikTok sharing these videos, so it must be true. And then there's a preemptive dismissal to any counter arguments. It's called poisoning the well, or an appeal to humility. By saying something like, I used to be skeptical too, it comes across as, why are you still skeptical? Why haven't you bought in? And so, how do you pull someone out from this dark, hidden pit of lies? The problem is the appeal to conspiracy theories. The appeal, which I've touched on, is don't trust what's clear, real truth is hidden, and only a few people know it, and you could be one of them. So, is truth something hidden that only a few people can find, or is it something open to all and tested by how we lived? And this is our transition into why John is so frustrated and has to be so direct and so clear with his audience. It's why I find it important for us to picture a group of people that we can all relate to. I mean, how many people do you know that used to be normal and then suddenly went off the deep end on a conspiracy, and you feel like you lost them? It's happened, and it's very sad to see, but the only way to pull them out of that is to shine a light on it, show them the truth.
A different view up there. I see the first line as being correct. When you think about God's truth, we're clearly told in biblical writings that most people are not going to see it. They're going to follow a lie. And its view will be, so maybe that's where some of the theorists get their thinking, because there is truth in the statement that, yeah, real godly truth is hidden to the masses. And that's sad. I'm sorry.
I would agree with that to a point. I would still say the light came into the world open for all. Christ came to the world to save all. And the problem with Gnostic thinking immediately limits the population that is available to receive this light. So there's certainly a dark force out there actively working to try and keep people from the light. But in terms of what Christ did, he revealed to all. All right, so with that in our background as our context, we could dive into 1 John here. So the text here is, we know, and this is only supposed to be verses 3 through 6, we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Whoever says, I know him, but does not do what he commands, is a liar, and the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in them. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. So it begs the question, how do you know that you know? You know? This is really the core issue here. How do we know that we know God? If it's this personal revelation that Gnosticism is teaching, that modern conspiracy theorists use, that you just have to dig, you have to look for the truth yourself, you can't trust the institutions, you can't trust those old apostles, John and Paul and Peter, you know, it's this new wave, this new exciting way of thinking. ignore what Jesus is teaching, ignore what the apostles are teaching. It's all personal. If that is your basis, I like the example that Jeff used, the spiritual salad bar. You take a little here, take a little there, and you've kind of created your own new religion. Then do you really know God at all? The word know there implies this intimate relationship, the way Adam knew Eve, the way that we know Jesus, that we know God. It's this very intimate, tied together relationship, not just not an idea that we have heard of and know in that regard. So what I think about how John is writing this letter is very similar to the way a lawyer or any legal document operates. If you look at any legal document, you're going to see pages and pages of definitions. And those definitions are vital. If you don't specify what you mean by a specific term, then somebody out there is going to poke a hole in it and say, well, you didn't mean this because it doesn't specify that. So the example here that I'll read is a person. We all know what a person is, right? Wrong. Legal documents specify it. It means an individual, corporation, partnership, limited liability, company, association, trust, unincorporated organization, legal entity. If somebody didn't specify that, then somebody would say, well, I have an LLC. Does that not count as a person? When they say a disclosure period, it means 24 months, not 25, not 23, 24 months. Do you see the specificity in that? And why that's so important to leave no gray area? Do you see how maybe John is trying to do that when he says, if we say we know God, this is how you know. If you say that you know Christ, you should obey his commands. There's a very clear definition of what it means to be a Christian. And unfortunately, at that time, it got messy, it got muddy. I think of the song, the hymn, Trust and Obey. This song has really been on my mind this week as I think about this passage from John. And at one point it sounded strange to me, the song Trust and Obey, but now I think it brings a different attitude. To know Christ is to trust and obey him. You can observe other Christians, you can observe yourself. That is the litmus test. Are they following Christ's commands, or are they saying one thing and living an entirely different way? The Apostle John is saying, this is clear as day. There's no gray area here. What we want to do is say, well, sometimes in this instance, under these circumstances, it might maybe be okay, but it's very black and white here for John. Can't claim to know and not obey. He calls you a liar. He says whoever says he abides in Jesus must live as he did. So I'll ask the question, how does this confront the mindset that says, I know better, but doesn't live any differently?
John kind of flips it. He says, if you truly know, the way you know that you know better is if you're living differently. If you think, I know Jesus, I've got it figured out, but then you're hating your brother like he talks about, that's direct evidence that you never knew it in the first place. It's not like doing the good things that gets you to know him. It's, I know him and therefore I do these things.
That's right, there's a call and a response there.
And it's the same, you find the same thing in 1 Timothy and in Titus with respect to leadership, picking elders and deacons and so on. Since we're not good at reading other people's hearts, God makes that clear in Samuel, 1 Samuel, then he's given us litmus tests to say, if you see these things, how they do with their family, how they do with their spouses, and so on, those are examples you can touch and feel and see. Since we don't judge the hearts very well, we don't have that x-ray vision, then we can use that, because if they are sincere and if they qualify in their heart, it's going to be demonstrated. You know a tree by its fruits.
That's right. Excellent point. So the next passage here is verse 7 and 8. And you could call it the old new command. You could call it the new old command. This passage trips a lot of people up just due to how it's worded. It sounds a little confusing. It makes you wonder, is John contradicting himself here? What's going on here? So let's read it. Dear friends, I am not writing you a new command, but an old one, which you have had since the beginning. This old command is the message you have heard. Yet, I am writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him and in you, because the darkness is passing and true light is already shining. So this begs the question, wait, is it old? Is it new? Is it back in style, like bell-bottom jeans? Is this something that came back? What's going on here? So the law that Moses gave back in the Old Testament, you have 10 commandments. Those 10 commandments are really separated into two groups. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor. The first 5 commands center around how do we love God. The other 5 center around how do I love my neighbor. All the other commands, all 613, all those commands circle back to how does this make me love God or how does this make me love my neighbor? All of them. It's centered around that idea. So I picked one here, Leviticus 19, verse 18. Moses says that God says, do not take revenge or bear a grudge against members of your community, but love your neighbor as yourself. I am Yahweh. So we think about the Old Testament, the old law, all of it being around loving God, loving neighbor. That's an old command. Yet, when Jesus came into the world, the light of the world, we saw this fully fleshed out, fully manifested in terms of what it meant to love your neighbor. He took the law and held it perfectly. He loved people perfectly. He loved God perfectly, and he was that perfect example. And so in John 13, Jesus says to his disciples, I give you a new command, love one another. Just as I have loved you, you must also love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. So again, this old command is fully seen in Christ, making it new. And there's no truth hidden by Christ. His teachings are plain, fully visible to all, and are a city on the hill. You think about verse 8 there, if we go back. Verse 8, I am not writing you a new command. Its truth is seen in him and in you, because the darkness is passing and the true light is already shining. What does light do? What is its property? It overcomes darkness. Does darkness ever overcome light? Could I have a flash dark and turn off the light by pointing it around? No, of course not. And so John is making an illustration here that light is overcoming darkness because it's visible, it's plain, it's seen by all. And he relates this to love, loving one another. Again, talking about the old and new commandment, John 13, verse 23, Jesus says, anyone who loves me will obey my teaching. My Father will love them, and we will come to them and make our home with them. Anyone who does not love me will not obey my teaching. These words you hear are not my own. They belong to the Father who sent me. So in the Gospels, in the Old Testament, in John's letter, the emphasis for loving your brother, loving each other, is heavily stressed. Jesus even calls us to love our enemies, to pray for our enemies. So how can we hate a brother if we're called to love our enemies? This is what John is confused by. And the fact that John is specifying that in this next part tells me that this is what was happening in that church, in that community at that time. If you've ever been to a swimming pool, you'll see like 15 different rules, a lot of them seemingly very random. Don't dive into the shallow end of the pool. It's probably because people were diving into the shallow end of the pool. Wear modest swim attire, probably because people were not doing that. So the fact that we have to spell that out and say, please refer to the rules, means that somebody was doing it and somebody got tired of saying to stop doing that. So I liken it in that way to what John is doing, where he is spelling out what it means to be a Christian to a new generation, a new audience. Here in verse 9 through 11, as we start approaching our close is anyone who claims to be in the light and hates a brother or sister is still in the darkness. Anyone who loves their brother and sister lives in the light, and there's nothing in them to make them stumble. But anyone who hates a brother or sister is in the darkness and walks around in the darkness. They do not know where they are going because the darkness has blinded them. So I ask you, is this true for all time and all people, or just to John's audience? All time. It's interesting, we want the gray area. We want to know when we can hate somebody, when we don't have to show love to somebody. I'm guilty of that. I'm 28 years old, and there have been many times in my life where I've been tempted to think, maybe there's an exclusion here, but there is not. We are called to love our enemies and especially love our brothers and sisters. So we see here loving others is walking in the light. Hating brothers and sisters is walking in blinding darkness. And like Don mentioned earlier, the passage, by their fruits you shall know them. This was something that was evident, that could be seen by all. I'll pause there. Any comments or questions? Yes.
Well, it's kind of hard to explain, but I just got through talking to Kevin about this recently. We're taught over and over again in the Bible to, like you said, not hate, but to love. And I was thinking about it with, like, Satan himself. It's like, well, if we were to hate Satan, we're kind of getting into what exactly he wants us to do, and that is to hate. But I'm not really saying we should love Satan. I'm not really sure how you go towards that part, but definitely don't hate. Any kind of hate is what Satan wants us to do.
Yeah, it's an interesting food for thought. How do we approach how we think about evil and the thing that epitomizes evil, Satan? Do we show love towards something like that when we know his fate? Or do we hate something that causes so many people to be pulled down? I think of in Jude, when Michael the archangel was contending with Satan, he did not blaspheme him. Is that loving? Is that hating? I don't know, but I just thought that was an interesting approach that we see in Scripture when it comes to our relationship with evil and darkness. So we'll wrap up here with this slide. We have about 6 minutes left, so we may end a few minutes early, but like Gnosticism, if we can tie the two together, I talked about the conspiracy culture, and I talked about the culture at the time with Gnostic thinking. The problem with those two groups of thought is that it tells people, don't trust what's plain in public, truth is hidden, and only a few people are smart enough or brave enough to find it. This is a line of thinking that, if we're not careful, starts to infiltrate our social media, our conversations with other people, and if we reject what has been passed down for 20 centuries now, we can very easily fall into this line of thinking. So John's letter, in my opinion, is a legal document that is making it black and white for a group of very confused believers. And he says, truth is visible, truth loves, and truth walks in the light. It doesn't hide in darkness, it doesn't hate, and it doesn't keep itself hidden. So that is what I have this week. Next week we'll dive into the next part of chapter 2, which talks about the fathers, the young men, and the children. So if you want to read ahead, go ahead and do that. But any parting questions or comments? Yes?
Truth and hate, we tend to think of that in terms of emotions, but in the Greek it's often referring to actions, not emotions. So we're not talking here about passionate feelings towards somebody. We're talking about how you act for feelings. I don't have my Greek with me, but I'm assuming he's using the word agape here in these verses.
So for those who couldn't hear, he was saying that the Greek way of thinking about hating or loving was more about action and not just feelings or thoughts. So the way that we would express that love or hate is by how we act, by what we do. and not just feelings or passion. So thank you for that comment.
Hate your brother, mother, and father more than me. I've always understood that word hate isn't what we assume it is. It's an attitude or a comparison.
Yeah, comparison, definitely. Yeah. Yes.
I was going to say earlier, when you were talking about communication, ways of learning stuff, not just the internet itself, but when you hear stuff from someone else, sometimes what they heard could not be true, and they're telling you what they think is the honest truth, and then you believe it. Next thing you know, you tell it to someone else, and it's incorrect, so it's probably best to try to find out, search for yourself, try to find out the truth, yes.
So with that, I will give you all 2 minutes extra. Thank you very much.